Good evening, and thank you for joining KERA in partnership with the National Council of Churches, SMU Perkins School of Theology, Paul Quinn College, and the NAACP Fort Worth Tarrant County Branch for a special virtual screening and discussion on Praise and Protest, the Black Church in North Texas. I'm Danita Malvern, Director of Community Engagement at KERA. We begin tonight's program with highlights from the Henry Louis Gates Jr. documentary, The Black Church. This is our story, this is our song. Immediately following the clips, we invite you to take part in a live discussion about the Black Church in North Texas with Dr. Evelyn Parker, Susanna Wesley Centennial Professor of Practical Theology at SMU Perkins School of Theology, Pastor William T. Glenn, pulpit minister of the Mount Olive Missionary Baptist Church in Fort Worth, and Dr. Michael Waters, founder and lead pastor of Abundant Life AME Church in Dallas. Our discussion is moderated by legendary journalist Bob Ray Sanders. To help fuel the discussion, submit your question or comment in the chat box provided. And now we begin our program with a special message from Dr. Henry Louis Gates Jr.
I'm Henry Louis Gates Jr. I'm thrilled to welcome you to this local event for our newest series, The Black Church, This is Our Story, This is Our Song, exploring the 400-year-old history of the Black Church in America. You'll be transported by the songs, by preaching styles, and by beliefs and actions that drew African Americans from the violent margins of society to the front lines of change. I'm honored to have the support of your local station. Thank you for being here today.
Corporate funding for the Black Church, This is Our Story, This is Our Song, is provided by Johnson & Johnson.
Not all Black American stories are easy or simple to tell. But for many years, Henry Louis Gates Jr. has told them like no one else. By rediscovering lost narratives, correcting historical misconceptions, and resurrecting forgotten heroes, Johnson & Johnson is honored to have supported him all these years and to still be along for this incredible journey.
Major funding is also provided by Lilly Endowment Incorporated and by the Ford Foundation, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by generous contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
Oh, I believe I will go back home. Well, I believe I will go back home. I believe I will go back home and be.
My mother's family has worshiped in this church for generations. The lessons I learned here, the power of faith, the importance of community, have remained with me and sustained me in the same way the Black Church has sustained the African American people from the days of slavery to this day.
The Black Church was more than just a spiritual home. It was the epic center of Black life. Out of it came our Black businesses, our Black educational institutions.
The church gave people a sense of value and of belonging and of worthiness. I don't know how we could have survived as a people without it.
We had to have some individual and institutional armor in order to preserve our sanity.
Culture says you're inferior. The Christ says you are an equal.
From hush harbors to suburban megachurches, it's been a sanctuary in which Black people could reinterpret the Bible in their own image and praise God in their own voices. Like all human institutions, the Black Church and its leaders have their shortcomings.
We were very quick to address racism, but very slow to address sexism and abuse.
Today we stand at a crossroads. What will be the future of the Black church?
Where's the African American church in Black Lives Matter? Where's the African American church with environmental justice movements?
I think that the church, particularly when the focus has been threefold: prophetic social justice, holiness, and spiritual empowerment and worship. When those three things are held together, the church has been a powerful force against sin, the sin of racism, the sin of oppression.
I've spent my career exploring stories about Black life, but there's one I've never told, and it might be the most important one of all. It's the remarkable history of the Black church. A key part of the Black community's survival during Jim Crow was the church's financial independence. Black congregants made sure that collection plates were full.
It was the first place of social cohesion for people of African descent, the first place of economics where we pooled our resources.
Poor people would give virtually everything they had to their churches to see those churches grow.
As Jim Crow took root and public spaces became increasingly segregated, a burgeoning Black consciousness began percolating within the church. In Atlanta, in the fall of 1895, Bishop Henry McNeil Turner, always at the radical edge of the Black church, delivered a blistering sermon at the first gathering of the National Baptist Convention. Bishop Turner asked for those in the room to see the face of God in a radical new way. It did not go over well.
I worship a Negro God. I believe God is a Negro. Negroes should worship a God who is a Negro.
Henry McNeil Turner comes along and he says, everyone has a God that looks like them.
Everyone, but us.
But us.
Right.
If we are created in the image of God, then God is Black.
When Henry McNeil Turner talks about that, that Jesus is a Black man, I'm sure everybody fell out. Everybody absolutely fell out. What? In the 19th century to say that? Absolutely extraordinary.
He's creating what we now call Black theologies. He's literally challenging several generations now of a complete kind of universality of the idea of Jesus as this white, blonde-haired guy.
He has a line where he says, Lord, have mercy on any race of people who do not believe that they look like God. And I think that sums up so much of what the Black church has fought its way through and has been fighting for. And that is to have its people see themselves as important to God, as not less than. And Henry McNeil Turner, he got that.
Now let us all go back to that old mount.
But the violent end of interracial democracy wasn't just radicalizing ministers such as Bishop Turner. Black churchwomen, whom male leaders had long pushed to the margins, began pushing back on the issues of ordination, preaching licenses, and the power of the purse. Why is the late 19th century referred to in Black history as women's era?
The women are excited. They have come into gender consciousness. And they are making the argument. According to the Bible, women have the right to preach. Women have the right to be in their own separate missionary organizations. Or women have the right to raise money for their churches and be in control of the money that they raise.
The membership of the African American church is somewhere between 80 to 90% women, but the leadership is 80 to 90% male.
In 1894, Julia Foote, at the ripe old age of 71, became one of the first two women to be ordained as a deacon in the AME Zion Church. As black male influence in the larger world began to shrink, some men became even more intent on holding on to their power within the church.
Unfortunately, the black church carries all the anxieties and insecurities born of the dominant society. And so therefore, the church becomes the space where black man can be that conception of manhood in American society, which is about power, power over.
In the Baptist church, an outspoken young activist protested that the sisters were hindered from helping. Her name was Nannie Helen Burroughs.
Nannie Helen Burroughs was one of the people who said that black women within churches were undervalued and overlooked, and invested all of her political and spiritual powers in the Women's Convention of the National Baptist Convention. She is inside the Black Baptist Church, but is a persistent critic of the Black Baptist Church.
For a number of years, there has been a righteous discontent, a burning zeal to go forward in his name among the Baptist women of our churches.
What did Nannie Burroughs mean by righteous discontent?
She says, for a number of years now, we have been out here in the fields doing missionary work, trying to get our women educated, trying to get our women jobs. But the key of the righteous discontent is just this sense that it's our time now.
Church women like Burroughs, who'd been the glue of their denominations, started to seize opportunities to expand their activities beyond church walls.
For some church women in these debates over power and authority, they raised the specter, even the threat, that perhaps they will leave the church communities if men can't accommodate their ambition. Some women will leave.
By 1896, the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs was formed in Washington, D.C. Their motto, lifting as we climb.
Woman, look at here, woman.
Martin Luther King Jr. always traveled with Jesus and the Disinherited. I mean, he'd clean underwear, shirt, and he'd have Howard Thurman in his briefcase. And he read Howard Thurman for inspiration.
So I am convinced that nonviolent resistance is the most potent weapon available to oppressed people in their struggle for freedom and human dignity.
Movement histories are often talked about in terms of heroes come in to save the day, you know, grand, larger-than-life figures lead people to victory or to liberation, and that's certainly not the way social movements unfold. At the end of the day, the freedom riders, those who work for SNCC, Dr. King, could not have done what they did and had the impact had it not been for those lay people who were brave enough to say, I'll march with you.
This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. Oh, this little light of mine, I'm gonna, oh, this little light of mine.
When it came to fundraising for the movement, one group in particular would help lead the way. Founded in 1962 by 4 organizers from the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, the Freedom Singers would travel across the country performing what became the soundtrack of civil rights marches and rallies, raising desperately needed funds to support SNCC's operations and civil rights work. One of those singers was 21-year-old Rutha Mae Harris. What was the relationship between the freedom songs you were singing and the songs from the church?
Well, the freedom songs were taken from gospel, congregational hymns. Only thing we had to do was change the lyrics to fit the occasion, whatever it was. Like, I woke up this morning with my mind stayed on Jesus. The only thing we had to change was I woke up this morning with my mind stayed on freedom.
How important do you think your music was to the success of the civil rights movement?
Personally, I feel that without the songs of the civil rights movement, there wouldn't have been a movement. Because the song kept us from being afraid. Say you're walking down the street doing a march, and this policeman tell you you're gonna be hit or whatever. You start singing, I ain't gonna let nobody turn me around.
Right.
Not even the chief of police.
Not even a billy club.
Not even a billy club.
The sound of the civil rights movement is not just a backdrop in terms of its religious substance. It is literally what gave the civil rights movement the financial means in order to continue. It was gospel artists like Mahalia Jackson who would give a concert and raise thousands of dollars. She helped to fund the Freedom Rides, helped to fund King as he traveled.
There were so few African Americans who were financially able to support the movement. But Mahalia did it on multiple levels. He could call Mahalia and they could talk through the dark times. And when things were really bad, we know that she sang to him.
In 1968, the Edwin Hawkins Singers from Oakland, California, debuted their gospel song, "Oh Happy Day."
When Jesus was, he washed my sins all away.
The group was one of several Pentecostal choirs emerging in the late 60s to bring a youthful energy back to the church. But this song was a dramatic break from the past.
I was so enthralled in the way that they presented the gospel. Shirley with her, beautiful, regal-looking self, and I'm like, oh my gosh, this is what I can aspire to, and then to also look cool doing it.
The song not only became an international hit, it also won a Grammy, and the choir was treated like rock stars. But the singers were criticized by Pentecostal church leaders who felt that the song's crossover success was too worldly to be properly religious.
Talk about the tensions between Saturday night and Sunday morning.
Entertainment shouldn't be in the church. What do you think the preacher does?
Yeah,
The preacher, and there
Yeah.
and if I,
Yeah.
and if I. But when the church makes the indictment that you don't serve God anymore, it hurts.
And sometimes it can drive people away from the church. In 1972, building on the success of Oh Happy Day, the Hawkins family opened a storefront church in Oakland. They called it the Love Center. And unlike mainstream Pentecostal churches, the Love Center adopted the Bay Area's countercultural approach to sexuality.
This is where the Hawkins family and the sort of Black Pentecostal community in the Bay Area is so important for thinking about a new era in Christianity.
In practice, same-gender loving brothers and sisters have been included at every juncture and in every phase of the life of our black churches. It's just kind of a don't ask, don't tell policy.
The Love Center's choir in pews became a haven for gay and lesbian singers, like gospel musician Yvette Flunder, the daughter and granddaughter of pastors. Flunder felt deeply alienated from the Pentecostal church in which she'd been raised.
I came from the church that was just don't. You just don't.
But you left the church for a time. Would you mind telling me about that?
I never had to leave church to be a same-gender loving woman. What made me an exile was because I decided to tell the truth. There's an awful price to pay. There are people who are very afraid. They're afraid to lose their churches. They're afraid to lose their positions. And so they remain deeply closeted.
But what had been repressed would find a novel way to be expressed when sacred churchy vocals fused with secular club rhythms to form disco's gay anthems. The genre's divas, like Sylvester, the queen of disco, had all been raised in the church.
Sylvester, who was raised in the Church of God in Christ, just like me, had that tune, had those licks, had that sound, had that vibe, you know? He said to me one day, he said, "It's amazing, Yvette." He said that the same people that turned me out. I'll never forget it.
Peter Gomes, a dear friend of mine, once remarked that the whole foundation of the black church was propped up by women and gay men.
How is it that a church that emerged out of a struggle for freedom would then indeed oppress its own members? If the black church is going to survive, it is going to have to be welcoming to the whole entire black community. Because otherwise, there's not going to be a church.
(911), what's the address of the emergency?
Please, Emmanuel Church, there's plenty of people shot down here. Please send somebody right away.
Emmanuel Church? And there's people shot?
Yeah, he shot the pastor. He shot all the men in the church. Please come right away. He's still in here. I'm afraid he's still in here. God, please. Oh, my God.
The nation is waking up to news of a senseless act of violence in Charleston, South Carolina. Right now, the search is on for a white gunman who entered a black church last night and started shooting. The massacre killed 9 people.
This was not the first racist attack on this congregation.
Somebody want to know why?
Yes, Lord. Need you, Lord.
God, why on tonight, God?
Nearly 2 centuries before, white people had destroyed Charleston's main black church. After the Civil War, it was proudly rebuilt as Mother Emanuel AME Church.
It was the worst fears come alive again. It was the 4 girls bombed in the church in Birmingham again. It's in the Bible class, in the black church. Historic black church, Mother AME, the core who we are. And if we couldn't protect ourselves there, what are we gonna do?
We do not know whether the killer of Reverend Pinckney and 8 others knew all of this history. But he surely sensed the meaning of his violent act. An act that he presumed would deepen divisions that trace back to our nation's original sin. Oh, but God works in mysterious ways.
In the face of unthinkable racial violence, the man who had navigated the complex web of race, religion, and politics at the start of his administration became the pastor for the nation.
Amazing grace. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound.
And that was the moment that this man, who looked like us, could stand up there and tell us, but remember amazing grace. We needed that.
The massacre was part of a resurgence of white supremacist activity that many of us thought we'd never see again.
Something has been let loose. And so religious folk must create a counter narrative to that. And I think the teachings of Jesus are just as clear that Christian folk and Christian leaders cannot abide or countenance anybody's supremacy over anybody else, white or anything, and cannot remain silent. Silence is consent.
Good evening, and thank you for joining us. I'm Bob Ray Sanders, and we're going to have a discussion here to talk about the Black church praise and protest, the Black church in North Texas. And I especially want to say that we did have some difficulty, I think, in the beginning with some of our audio issues, but we got taken care of. And I want to reintroduce our guest who is joining us here, Dr. Michael W. Waters, the founder and lead pastor of the Abundant Life African Methodist Episcopal Church in Dallas. He's also a prolific author, activist, and social commentator. Also joining us is Dr. Evelyn Parker, the Susanna Wesley Centennial Professor of Practical Theology at Perkins School of Theology at Southern Methodist University. We were also expecting Reverend William T. Glenn, pastor of Mount Olive Missionary Baptist Church in Fort Worth, but he's had some difficulties with his internet service. So we'll go with the two people that we have here. And of course, you can join us also with your questions, and we'll get to those toward the end of this program. Thank you both for joining me. Let me just start out with this. I mean, we saw the good history of the Black church, the legacy, if you will, through some of the video clips. But I'm wondering from you, considering the racial injustices that we're seeing today in our society, and that we have seen, frankly, throughout the years, is the Black church in the forefront as it was 30, 40, 50 years ago? Michael?
Well, I think that's a tremendous question, and I think it requires us to address some mythologies. Dr. Kerry Day suggests to us that only 10% of Black churches were engaged in the Poor People's Campaign in 1968. And I think in kind of our collective memory for today, we seem to think that all Black churches have been deeply involved in matters of social justice, and that's just not the case. I think that there is room to make the claim that in some places and spaces, the Black church does continue to be a leading edge of change, but to root the statement historically, the Black church has not been the only leading edge within our history. But I do see signs of the church leading in protest, leading and demanding changes in society, as the Black church has done at times throughout its history.
Dr. Parker?
I would agree with Dr. Waters. As the documentary has taught us, and those of us who viewed it, is that Black churches were not even involved during the Civil Rights Movement, not 100%. And some of the commentators, some of the contributors to that document indicated that, I think it was Dr. Samuel Barber, Bishop Barber, said that he only could imagine what it would have been like if there were more Black churches involved in the Civil Rights Movement. It's true there's never been the case where you've had an overwhelming participation of Black congregations involved. But we can point to not only the Black church, but those who affiliate themselves with the Black church, like the Orthodox Church, and some Catholic leaders, Orthodox and Catholic leaders, and also persons who were from the Muslim community were in solidarity with the Civil Rights Movement and other justice movements as they are today.
Right, and as I think about those photos from the '63 March on Washington, there was a collection of various people who were involved. But when we talk about North Texas, Dallas, Fort Worth, and you two have a connection there, was Dallas, Fort Worth as involved as we thought the other part of the country was involved? I mean, that is from the Black church experience.
I'll tell you, there's been an open debate in the community, and there are persons who weighed in on it. I don't think it appropriate to suggest that there was an absence of the civil rights movement in Dallas. Indeed, there were persons who were very active. Juanita Craft, the NAACP Youth Division was very active in their demands for justice and in desegregating the state fair. But I think the real question that we're asking is whether or not the church was as involved as it could have been as a collective. And, it has been suggested that portions of the Black church in Dallas in particular were in cahoots with the white business elites of our city that sought to quail uprisings within our community. And so we have to wrestle with that history, that it's very well possible the Black church in North Texas was not all in, or at least was not as fully committed to the cause of justice as they should have been. And then maybe as a greater issue were in fact being used by other power interests to limit the activism and call for justice amongst the Black community.
Do you agree? You're nodding your head, Dr. Parker. You agree with that?
I do agree with that. And I want to say that one of the frustrations that I think that young people experience is the hypocrisy of the church to position itself as if it's going to be prophetic, but yet and still his hypocrisy becomes so evident when it is not involved, and when the members of Black congregations take a back seat when it's time to step up and step forward, especially on behalf of young people who are being abused and mistreated in everyday life, such as in their schools, and sometimes even in the church. But we can talk about that at another point.
Right, yeah, I want to come back to the youth, because I know your specialty, or at least one of your specialties, is adolescent religion. And Dr. Parker, they're asking you to turn down your volume a little bit, if you can. I think they're getting some feedback. But let's go back to this point, because now I grew up in Fort Worth. My family goes back 150 years there, and obviously grew up in the church. But there were always the ministers that the white establishment would come to in the Black community, as you suggested, Dr. Waters, to keep a lid on things, or be the spokesperson downtown when it was time to do certain things. Was that necessarily a bad thing? Or, as some would suggest, that at least we had a chance to give our voices, or let our voices be heard, sometimes behind closed doors? And do you call us a sellout for having done that?
Well, I think we have to look at the effects of the absence of that type of radical, if you will, call to justice within Dallas in particular. Let's look at what Dallas is today. According to the Urban Institute's report in 2018, April 25th of 2018, the city of Dallas ranks dead last in America in terms of racial equity and racial segregation, 274th out of 274 American cities with a population of 100,000 residents or more. We have led the nation in childhood poverty. Currently, we're number 3. We lead the nation in the most concentrated communities of poverty, which have actually grown from 16 in 1990 to 36 today. When you look at what has happened with environmental racism with regards to Shingle Mountain, when you look at all of the disparities that are present, many of which have been heightened because of the pandemic of COVID, as well as by the winter storm, you see what an absence of activism has wrought, that the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of those who failed to lift their voices are experiencing multiple pandemics, food apartheid, a lack of access to medical care. As a matter of fact, in Dallas County, Black people today earn only 54 cents to a white person's dollar, and on and on and on. And so you see what happens when you make concessions with white supremacy. And ultimately, that's what happened. This was an invitation to make a concession that we will make room and space for you as long as you quiet the call and ambition of the people to rise above their oppression. And so I think we have to judge who we are today in many respects by a failure to take action in days past.
And certainly we're not going to put all of that on the Black church, because we have Black politicians now who've been elected to deal with some of the same things you just outlined here.
But I think part of the problem is we have this expectation that simply because you have a Black face in power, that they can make changes. But in fact, if you still have a white supremacist leaning power structure, it is going to hinder their ability to bring about true liberation.
Dr. Parker, you mentioned that the Black churches and Black people in general in their struggle have had allies. The Jewish people, for example, I know at least one congregation in Fort Worth where there was a rabbi who was always there on the front line, Rabbi Shur, Bethel congregation. There were those from the Catholic Church, as you suggested, who came down. I remember in 1965, I don't remember the incident itself, but I've read about it, when a Black Methodist preacher led a demonstration downtown, and he was joined by those other folk who came in to help from other congregations. My fear now is I'm wondering, has the white Christian or the white clergy given up on Black folk, or do we still have allies there?
That's an interesting question. I would, not being catty, but I think that's a question that needs to be posed to them. I think that there are persons who have good relationships with white congregations. I know that the leader of St. Paul United Methodist Church has a good relationship with First United Methodist Church, which is a few blocks away from St. Paul's, and they have worked together to have conversations about race and racism, and they have had prayer calls to kind of enhance that collaboration. But in terms of white congregations being in solidarity with Black congregations, that would be a good question to ask some of the religious leaders that are in the Dallas community, and perhaps Dr. Waters can respond to that. But I'm a transplanted Texan that's now transitioning out, but I can recall when I first was coming to Texas, or coming specifically to Dallas, and had some relationship with the Greater Dallas Community of Churches, which was active then. And that was a vibrant organization that work towards racial solidarity around issues of justice. And also, there were other entities that worked towards racial solidarity as well. But one organization that was particularly African American that I thought was a progressive justice arm of the Black clergy was the African American Pastors Coalition, where Zan Holmes, the Reverend Dr. Zan Holmes, had leadership in both forming and being a leader in its activities. There were others who joined in that leadership, the pastor of Friendship West, as well as the pastor of Kirkwood Temple CME Church. And there are a number of others from the AME and AME Zion communities. But that voice, under the leadership of Reverend Dr. Zan Holmes, had a prophetic voice and presence in the Black community, as I recall, in the 90s, as well as going into the early 2000 rather. So those were times that the Black church was active through the leadership of the Black clergy, both economically as well as doing some other things that met the needs of Black people. But I would like to invite Dr. Waters to respond to that, because he has given some really good, some statistics around what is happening now, and maybe he can make some connections with the past.
And as we go to him, Dr. Waters was a student of yours, I understand?
Yes, and I continue to learn from him then and even now.
Okay, I was going to say, it looks like he's learned well. I mean, you care to pick up on what she was just saying, Dr. Waters?
Well, she's still my professor, and I hope that anything I say right is from her. Anything I say wrong is purely from me. Let me say this, that I had the privilege of serving as one of the inaugural chairs of Faith Forward Dallas, one of the largest multi-faith movements really in the country. Over 300 pastors, imams, rabbis, serving together on matters of peace and justice, who really became nationally known, if you will, in our response following the July 7th shootings here in Dallas, and were very active as a part of bringing down Confederate monuments. And that multi-faith interracial group was very active and continues to be in many respects. There are other groups such as Faith in Texas that are very active in a progressive arm, pressing for peace and justice today. But you know what? Those pastors that you mentioned in Fort Worth and Dr. King himself, they are a part of a wonderful tradition that extends all the way back to Jesus and the prophets, who were also called troublemakers for the actions in which they engage. I am one who believes that, as the scriptures say, if all the things people say about you is positive and glowing, you're probably not doing too much to bring about a new day. And so sometimes the clearest sign that you are actually committed in advancing justice is the critiques that you receive.
Yeah, and Dr. Porter, as Dr. Waters just suggested, when Martin wrote that letter from that Birmingham jail, he was writing to ministers, and people tend to forget that, it seems to me. But you're on the campus of SMU. What do you see coming through that school? I mean, everybody's not like this person who's here with us now, your former student. Do you see the possibility of change, hope coming through those students?
That's a lovely question. One of the reasons why I continue to research on young people, both teenagers that are what they call tweeners, that's the 12-year-olders, or 9, 10, 11, 12, as well as 15 through 18, and then all the way up through college age, 25 or so, is because I really think, out of my own spirituality, I think that that's the hope that God has put in our place, is the young people, and that if there's going to be any change, if there's going to be a revolution, if I can use that term, it will come from that sector. Not all young people, but you just need a few. if you look historically at the civil rights movement or any movement, even the children's movements of earlier times, historically, you'll see that they were involved in changing the world, bringing about justice in a way that is kind of outside of the margins of what we understand justice to be. And just look at who Jesus was. He was a young adult, for goodness sakes, in our understanding who he was. He was a person who was on the cusp of asking questions to the establishment. And that's what's intriguing to most young people. Now, in terms of Southern Methodist University's campus, while the majority may not be so concerned with changing things, addressing white supremacy and racism, and the power structures that manifest themselves in terms of money and the use of money, who has access to it, who does not, in terms of justice for women and girls, or for women, or even persons who identify themselves outside of the norm, people who are same gender loving. There are a remnant that is among those students on SMU's campus that I think have the momentum and the voice and the power and the mind to change things. It won't be immediate, but I think it will be constant. I think it will be coming forth gradually. I have had an opportunity to interview and have conversations with some of those young people. And on the earlier clips that you showed as leading up to the clips from the documentary, there were some faces that were quite familiar to me and perhaps to Dr. Waters, of persons who were from Perkins, who are now in Washington, D.C. And I'm speaking now of Christian Watkins, who was on that campus and who was about justice and bringing about justice, spoke to the powers to be while he was there, just like Dr. Waters did when he was in undergraduate, as well as in the graduate school at Perkins School of Theology. So it doesn't take a whole lot. It takes some committed few that can speak to the issues and stand firm about the issues and say, no, this cannot happen anymore. There are a number of young people who I have experienced in my time being at SMU over the 20 some odd years, but there are others I don't know about that I know that are also on the way. They are about changing the system, so to speak, on that campus. And there's a lot that should be spoken to, should be addressed. And there are a lot of issues that young people are poised to address. So that's where that's where the hope is. If there's promise, if there are possibilities, it's in young people. And I truly believe that.
You know, I mean, I gotta add this because I've been around so long that I had lost hope for a while. And I kept saying, it's when the young people get grown up, they'll change it. And then I never saw it in the numbers that I wanted to see it. And then since the death of George Floyd, we had daily demonstrations in Dallas and Fort Worth, sometimes 3 or 4 a day. And the majority of the people I saw were not only young people, but they were young white people.
Yes.
So I sort of got the hope again. And Dr. Waters, you have one of the titles of your book is Stakes is High, Race, Faith, and Hope. Do you share the same hope that I think I heard coming from Dr. Parker?
I have hope, but it's not a falsified hope. It's one that is rooted in our contemporary experience. And here's the reality. We live at a time of insurrections against the U.S. government. We live in a time of a mounting body count, more hate groups active now in America than ever in American history. The state of Texas has 10% of all hate groups in our nation. And in fact, it was white supremacists here in Texas that radicalized Dylann Roof. And let us not forget that it was a young white supremacist from North Texas that drove 10 hours, 650 miles to kill in cold blood Latino persons mainly, in a Walmart in El Paso to stop the so-called Hispanic invasion of Texas. All those things are happening right now. And as we saw marches taking place in Charlottesville, we have to acknowledge the fact that the face of racism today is a young white face. We have to acknowledge the fact that the city of Dallas gave birth to a Richard Spencer, the leader of the alt-right. So right here in North Texas, let's think about that. The alt-right has a connection here. All of the young persons who travel to DC to participate in insurrection from Dallas, one who drove 650 miles to the west to kill here. So we have to acknowledge that. We have to recognize what's going on in our nation now. And yet still, I find reason and opportunity for hope for the very reasons that you've mentioned. Black Lives Matter movement of 2020 was the largest social justice movement in American history. And so both things can be true. We are in a very perilous point in our nation's history where we are literally fighting for the sake of democracy or some semblance of it to maintain it. And at the same time, we see these tremendous outpourings of support in the streets that ultimately I hope will be effective in bringing about policy change. And that's, I think, where the rubber hits the road. It's not simply the protests. It's not simply the activism in the streets, but the success is the ability to bring about policy changes. And that's the civil rights movement was all about. I know everyone, or a lot of people get caught up in Dr. King's words about peace and joy and holding hands and overcoming. But at the end of the day, those courageous women and men wanted to change the laws and policies of this land to bring about peace, justice, equity, and equality. And so we're still waiting to see whether or not these current uprisings will ultimately lead to the policy changes that we all desire to see, particularly around policing in America.
And speaking of another issue along the, because I know, Dr. Wallace, you've spoken a lot about disenfranchisement, the voting that we are trying to deal with all over again. I mean, we thought we had won the battle back in 1965 with the Voting Rights Act, and suddenly here we are fighting the same battles again. I mean, every legislature almost in the country now is trying to figure out a way how to keep people from voting again. And then there are people who say, well, wait a minute, the church shouldn't even be involved in getting people to vote because that's getting involved in politics. Just a basic question. Should the church be involved in politics?
Is so absolutely. Let me just say, the church is politics. I mean, the very nature of what the church is a political enterprise. And we can go from the meetings that pastors hold on a quarterly or a monthly basis or whatever, that is a political engagement, regardless of the race of the church. And it happens within Black churches as well. What is unfortunate is that you do have congregants who have been, and I'm going to say, miseducated about not only what politics is, but what the role of the church is. And unfortunately, some of that miseducation is a power play. If a religious leader wants to control the activities of the congregation, they educate in a way that people don't think. And I would argue, just as Michelle Fine has argued about school dropouts, that you see not only young people, but thinking adults dropping out of the church because they don't want to be controlled by someone who does not entertain their questions and don't allow them to think.
Are you dropping out of the church? I mean, are they staying in the church? I mean, they get taken to church, but when they're
leaving the church, they don't come.
They don't, okay.
They don't come because they're not allowed to ask questions. Let me give you the example that I give most of my students. And I step up on what I call my bullet pulpit when I say this. Okay. When a pastor calls Bible study an opportunity for him to give a mini sermon, but does not involve the congregants who are in that Bible study in opening the biblical text, reading the passages, and asking questions like, what does this mean? Who's saying this? Why is it being said? Actually studying the scripture and having on the wall or having in the bookshelf dictionaries, reference books, commentaries, ways to actually study the biblical text. And we're just talking about Bible study. If that's used as an opportunity to share their own message, that is keeping people in a state of ignorance so they cannot learn how to think about the text and make it relevant for their lives. That's not Bible study. So now I'll step down from my pulpit and say, people who are really hungry for a way to understand their own religious faith and how it is connected with everyday life is what draws people into a congregation, what draws them to church. Now, I'm not, I don't want to make the myth of that mega churches are having large numbers because people are asking questions. No, that's not what I'm talking about. But most persons who are disaffected with the church, who have dropped out of the church, is because the church does not allow them to explore the questions that they have and deal with the pain that they have. And young people are particularly intolerant of such types of congregations. So my point here is that if you want to see movement of people who are interested in changing injustice, you have to open up space for them to ask the questions as it relates to the Bible and the theology that is behind that and the church itself. I hope I'm making myself clear here.
Well, you are. And in fact, one of the things I was going to bring up, I mean, the two of you are excellent orators. And I know, Dr. Waters, you were all over the country speaking. You're well known as an orator. The oratory of the Black church. Yes, I mean, they have to open up and listen to people who are coming in, but there's power just in the voice. Your two voices speak to people, but I get the impression that, as you were suggesting, Dr. Parker, that you also listen in addition to speak.
Yes, it has to be both. And I think listening to the questions.
Okay.
It is not in the answers. It's in the beauty of a mind that can ask the question that transforms the problems. Because as Dr. Waters has said about policies, if you can get the right question on the table, that's the beginning of transforming bad policy into new policy, new laws that can impact the lives of people every day.
Okay, looks like he's agreeing with you. I see him nodding his head.
I do, and there's so much to agree with. I mean, one of the things that we have to acknowledge is that the very nature of a Black church is a political statement, right? The Black church emerges as a response to white supremacy. That's the only reason it exists. And so that is a political statement, and it is in and of itself the beginnings of the civil rights movement and human rights movement here in the nation, right? When the Black church is at its best, it's a conversation. If we think of things theologically from a point of Trinitarianism, God dwells in community with God's self, God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit, dwelling in community, interacting one with another. The same thing happens in the church. The church is at its best as a conversation, not just between the pulpit and the pews, between the musicians and the ushers. It's where the sermon informs the missions, which informs the evangelism, which informs the discipleship, which informs the fellowship, which informs the outreach. It's not merely centered on the voice of that pastor, whoever she or he is, but it is the collective genius that gives birth to CDCs and banks, that gives birth to schools. My great-great-great-grandfather, the Reverend William Leake, who was born into slavery in 1872, born in slavery in North Carolina, came to Texas, and in 1872 was one of the 4 founders of Paul Quinn College. That was an act of the Black church, recognizing that our people needed to be educated, and it was a conversation, if you will, amongst those persons to create an institution from the ground up. That's the genius of the church. That's the power of the church, this collective action. And yes, I think that one of the great gifts of the Black church to America and the world has been its, not just its oratory, right, but its gift of thought. Oftentimes what people perceive to be the United States of America can really be perceived as the promise articulated by the Black church, right? When people think about who we are as a nation, they oftentimes reflect not just on our founding documents, but how the Black church exegeted those documents to expand the embrace and bring more people into that collective. And because of that, I want to say, as President Barack Obama said when he was eulogizing the great John Lewis, he called John Lewis a modern day founding father, right, of a better and fuller America. That's the gift of the Black church, right? The ability to take the Christianity that was intended to bring about marginalization and oppression from enslavers, and instead find a true and authentic liberator named Jesus, and to use that motivation to carry forth through abolition and through the civil rights movement, and even in present day fights for justice. That's the genius of the church. It's the genius of the church to take these founding documents that said all are that God has given us these inalienable rights, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, and find a way of inserting Blackness into that proclamation and expanding the perception of what that document actually means. I fundamentally believe that the Black church is, in fact, the greatest institution in America, not just in terms of its oratory, not in terms of its religious contributions, but if you talk about the arts, you don't have jazz, you don't have blues, you don't have the spirituals, you don't have hip hop without the Black church. When you talk about leadership, from Rosa Parks on, they were cultivated, they were strengthened within the context of the Black church. And we can go on and on and on. Political thought, that's the gift of the Black church. But that's because, as I believe James Code and others have said so powerfully, that God is on the side of the oppressed. And there have been no persons oppressed in the same way on these shores as have Black people.
Yeah, and I don't want to glaze over the fact that you said one of your ancestors was one of the founders of Paul Quinn.
Yes, the Reverend William Leake. He was a circuit riding preacher, began preaching on his enslavers' plantation after the American Civil War, came to Texas. The Bicentennial Encyclopedia of the AME Church said that he brought 5,000 individuals into the church in Texas. And it was my great blessing that in the Bicentennial Encyclopedia of the AME Church, his great-great-great-grandson, which is me, had an entry. And so I'm so excited about that spiritual heritage, and not just him, but my great-grandmother, the Reverend Willie B. Williams, was the first woman ordained in the state of Texas in the AME Church, who was a history maker in her own right. And that family and spiritual heritage is something that continues to guide me today.
I got just a couple more questions, and then I'm going to let you go. Y'all have been great. I really appreciate this. But you mentioned a female in the video that we saw earlier. It talked about how women were treated in the Black church. And I grew up in the little churches I grew up in. Women certainly were given a place. It was not in the pulpit, for sure. It was not even to serve communion, supposedly, but we had so few men. If the women didn't do certain things, they wouldn't have gotten done. Are we still fighting that battle in churches today that women can't do certain things? Come on, Dr. Parker.
Yes, we are. There are still churches mainline denominational churches that might have changed their policies where women can now be leaders, but they still struggle with with congregants that will follow them, and that includes women. But then there are other churches or under denominations that even in Texas that will not allow women to be ordained, and a number of women I have discovered have come to seminary and have left the church of their childhood or where they were brought up and come over to those denominations that will allow them to be ordained, like the AME, CME, AME Zion churches, as well as United Methodist churches and other denominations that will allow them to be ordained. But we still have that problem with churches that will not ordain women, and then in some instances where they are ordained, you don't have women who are leaders in those congregations because the congregation is not prepared to actually let them be a leader in that congregation.
You want to comment on that, Dr. Waters?
Absolutely. You know, I had a very unique experience. My mother is an ordained elder in the church. I already mentioned my great grandmother. As I grew up, there were women who served as my pastor. As I have been a pastor, I've had the privilege of serving under the leadership of women who have been my presiding elder. My bishop currently is a woman, the first woman bishop in AME Church, Vastine Murphy McKenzie, who actually wrote the foreword to the book you referenced that I wrote, Stakes is High. So I've had a unique experience. I have been privileged to be nurtured and strengthened and encouraged and formed under the spiritual leadership of women in my family and the church. But I can also acknowledge that we have not done enough to advance the cause of gender equality within the church. There is still a stained glass ceiling, if you will. There's certain appointments that women still won't receive within an appointed structure. The top churches, if you will, are not always accessible to women. But I also want to turn this on its head. A great bit of the opposition that women receive in the church is actually from other women. And that has to be acknowledged as well. That oftentimes my colleagues who happen to be women have expressed some of the challenges and difficulties that they've experienced serving in communities when they were opposed in that service by other women.
Okay, final question, folks. And again, I really appreciate you. A lot of people think that the modern day Black church is focused more on economy of religion, i.e. money, as opposed to the treatment of their fellow human beings that we've been talking about. Want to have a quick response to that?
I'll start, and if that's okay, Dr. Waters. Those churches that are focused on what the PBS documentary called prosperity gospel, I would say prosperity theology, are prevalent churches. Those churches are many, and unfortunately, it's not just certain types of churches. It spreads across a number of denominations that have focused on economics more than on other issues, and that's unfortunate, especially for those who have been alienated or estranged from the church. Because as one of my colleagues or one of my former pastors said, that as he was substitute teaching with some 8th graders, they said, "Oh, you one of those preachers, and all y'all are interested in is getting money." So that's the stigma that young people that anecdotally have about preachers and some denominations. And that's unfortunate because, and that's been around for quite some time. And I alluded to persons who've been, young people who are not in the church anymore because they have not been given an opportunity to find a place to embody and actualize their own religious understandings to change the world as a person of faith. So they opt out of the church. And that's one of those issues that hinders young people from coming into the church, because if they perceive the church is all about money and not about helping people to live better lives, they don't want anything to do with the church. So that's how I would respond to that question in terms of that particular age group. There are others. I mean, there are some adults who don't like to be a part of those churches, who are just interested in money. But on the other hand, there are some adults who do. So it's not a black and white issue, so to speak.
Okay. Dr. Waters, final word.
Thank you. And it's been a delight to share this space with you and with my professor. And thank you for the opportunity. We began our journey today, at least my initial statements was to break away with myths. And I think I want to conclude by breaking away with myths again. One is that the majority of pastors in America are bivocational. That's the majority. The large number of pastors have to work another job to support their ministry. The majority of our churches are a large church in America is actually a church that has 300 members. Most gathering churches, many churches are not gathering now because of COVID, but most gathering churches have only about 50 to 100 members in the pews on a given Sunday. So mega churches and the prosperity message, that's largely an outlier. It just appears larger because of media, because you turn on the television, you turn on the internet. These are the persons you readily see. But the majority of pastors in America, the majority of churches in America are intimate, small communities that give significant contributions, not only to their members, but to their neighbors on a weekly basis. If you did not have these churches, there's a lot of people who would fall through the nets of poverty to the street. I can't tell you how many black churches in particular take up an additional offering to help you pay for that rent or that mortgage, to help you keep those lights on, to help you bail out that person if someone needs to be bailed out, to help you even bury someone after they have passed away. And those are the churches that unfortunately don't get much time and attention. We focus more on the larger congregations with the massive crowds and the lights, and we fail to see those churches that are making a difference, except when crisis arise. I always find that interesting, and I've experienced it. Others have experienced it in ministry. I can't tell you how many black pastors bury the members of mega churches, because while they could attend that mega church, the mega church didn't necessarily have time for their funeral or to offer care for the family. I can't tell you how many times people turn to these churches. Many of these are neighborhood churches that were good enough for their grandmother, grandfather, their mother, but wasn't good enough for them until they fell into crisis. And I'll finally conclude by saying this. The American Civil Rights Movement was most beneficial to the upwardly mobile Black in America. Those are the ones who were able to seize the opportunities immediately afforded by the rights that were claimed. But unfortunately, in many senses, the impoverished Blacks of America were left behind. Some of the churches abandoned the historic Black communities and followed the money out to the suburbs, and have done a disservice to the very persons we should have been fighting for. Let's not forget, again, that Dr. King's final movement was the Poor People's Campaign. It was an invitation for the church not to forget about the dispossessed, but to bring them along across the river into a collective and communal prosperity, to eradicate poverty and to ensure that everyone had all they needed, not just to live, but to thrive. And I think that is the call for the Black church and churches at large, but particular for the Black church today. Until we once again pick up the mantle of Christ, who said, when I was hungry, you fed me. When I was thirsty, you gave me drink. When I was naked, you clothed me. And they asked, when did we do this? And Jesus says, when you do it to the least of these, you've done it unto me. Until we collectively pick up that mantle again, we will not fulfill the true promise and glory of the Black church.
Dr. Michael W. Waters, Dr. Evelyn Parker, thank you both for a very inspiring conversation. Thank you. Really appreciate it.
Thank you
very much.
We're going to close out with a video from the National Council of Churches and a word from KERA.
The National Council of Churches of Christ in the USA, a faithful witness to the living Christ in the public square since 1950, representing 38 Christian denominations, advocating for and representing God's love, justice, and peace in our nation. Working with interfaith and secular partners on an agenda of ending racism and fostering prophetic transformation from Washington, D.C., translating the NRSV Bible, promoting Christian education and spiritual formation, and convening table interfaith dialogues. The National Council of Churches, many standing in solidarity for justice and peace as one.
We'd like to thank our moderator, Bob Ray Sanders, and our distinguished panel, Dr. Evelyn L. Parker, Pastor William T. Glenn, and Dr. Michael W. Waters, for sharing their time and insights with us this evening. If we were unable to answer your question or respond to your comment during the program, please reach out to us via email at engage@kera.org, and we'll be happy to provide a response. We thank all of our attendees for joining us for this very important conversation, and we invite you to visit our Black Church webpage at kera.org/Black Church. Thank you and good night.